So Matthew chapter 20 is where we are. And we'll start off by reading verses 1 through 16. Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour, and saw others standing idle at the marketplace, and said unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. And he went again about the sixth and ninth hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out, and found others standing idle, and said unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He saith unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive. So when he was come, the Lord of the vineyard said unto the steward, Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. And when they came, when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more, and they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the goodman of the house, saying, These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden of the heat of the day. But he answered of them, and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last, even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the last shall be first, and the first last. For many be called, but few chosen. As we look at this text this morning, we're going to see that he's going to hit the idea of what it means to be a servant. The fact that we were designed to be servants. From the very beginning of our life and our creation, we were meant to work. And I guess that's why it should come to no surprise to us that in eternity we will have jobs, because we were meant to work from the very beginning. I know that most people would feel that work is a curse, but that's not the case. Work is not a curse. The sweat of the brow was meant to be a curse. The weeds that would grow in your garden were meant to be a curse, but the work itself was not meant to be. I know there's a big movement of younger people to try to find ways to work as little as they possibly can, and try to create as much travel and other things as they possibly can. And I understand that's enjoyable, there's pleasure in that, but that's not what God made us for. I remember watching a video on YouTube about a guy that was in his 20s, and he actually went on The Price is Right and won one of their big showcases, and it was a travel. He had like 3 trips he could take, and he made up his mind after he got done with that all he wanted to do was travel, but yet he was like 24 years old. So he ended up buying a small van and converting it over to a house, and then limiting their expenses as much as possible so they could find as many ways to live minimalistically so they could do nothing but travel. And I'm not faulting the guy for that, but again, it's our general mindset that our number one goal in life is to make it to the point where we don't work anymore, and that's not what God said. In fact, we know that there may come a time when we retire from physical labor, but we never retire from the work of the ministry of God. And so as he's dealing with this, he's talking to these disciples who yet again, and we can't throw rocks at them because we're the same way, but yet again bring up the who's going to be first argument. I can't remember the name. I can't remember who was in the skit, but the who's on first. I don't know if you remember the baseball skit, who's on first. What was that? Was that Abbott Costello? That's it. I couldn't remember who it was, but yeah, theirs was always, they played that skit quite a few times, who's on first. And that's exactly what they're going to do here. But as we get ready to get into this, you ever ask yourself, what on earth am I doing here? I mean, what's my purpose? I get up every morning, I get dressed, I get the kids dressed, I get them to school, I make the beds, I clean the house, I cook, I go to work, whatever the case is. You've got a set of things you do every single day, and it's just nothing but repetitiveness. And some of the times it creates madness, because you just realize that I'm going to go to bed just to do the same thing tomorrow. I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to do the same thing tomorrow. And the question becomes, again, what am I actually here for? Am I here just to make sure that that four things about this high or smaller don't starve to death? Am I here just for the simple fact of making sure that the government has somebody to tax? What am I here for? And in this Matthew chapter 20, Jesus begins telling the story about a man who gave people a reason to live, who gave people a purpose in their life. And as a result, he's going to also show us that the end goal is not to be about, again, who's first. And in this section, we're going to start off again in verses 1 through 16. We're going to look at the parable that Jesus gave about our service. And Matthew's gospel is full of parables because Jesus spoke in parables a lot. We know, as he would say, and other times he spoke in parables sometimes so that people wouldn't understand, which of course goes against the thought of why you teach in parables. Normally you would say you teach in parables because it's a heavenly story or earthly story with a heavenly meaning. But a lot of times when Jesus spoke in parables, it was an earthly story with a heavenly meaning that you weren't supposed to get. And then later he would teach the disciples what it meant. And he would even say that, why do you teach in parables? So that they won't understand. Because it's given unto you to understand, but not to them. But other times when he taught it in parables, it was simply for a better understanding. And in this section, as he's teaching on the parable, he's going to use this as a teaching lesson to the disciples about what it means to be a servant. And in this particular parable, he focuses on our service to God. And it's very important for us to remember that when Jesus is dealing with this parable, he's talking about service, and he's not talking about salvation. So he's not talking about the fact that, those that are called into the labor in the field are the saved. He's talking to saved people already. He's talking more about the service in the field and not the getting into the field. He's assuming this is a saved group of people I'm talking to. Why? Because he's talking to the disciples. Of course, we know that one of them was not, and he knew that as well, but he was specifically dealing with saved people in their service, not about salvation. As we look at this, and we're going to see the analogy given in this parable, Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is similar to a landowner who hires men to go out into the field to do the work of the vineyard. And obviously the vineyard was large because he had enough work that he could go out and grab a whole bunch of guys to start first thing in the morning at 9 a.m. And then he still had enough work to do. He could go back out 3 hours later at noon and hire a group of more men to come out and work. Then he would go back out again at 3 o'clock and get them to go back into the field and go back to work. And then he would say on the 11th hour, because their day started at 6. So at that point, that would be 5 o'clock. Their day started at 6 and it ended at 6. So he went out and got 4 separate groups. One at 6, one at 9, one at 12, and then he'd pick up a 4th group right there at the 11th hour. So right when work was basically about to be finished up. So obviously we know one thing: he had a huge field to work. Number 2, we know he needed a lot of workers. And number 3, we know he was a very wealthy man. Why? Because he had the ability to hire people even at the last hour and pay them a day's wage, even though they didn't get a day's worth of work done. So as he started this group off, and he picked up this first crew at 6 in the morning, we know that the agreement made with this first crew was, look, when this job starts, if you'll work the whole day, you'll get a penny. Nobody argued. Nobody was upset. They all said, that sounds fair to me. And they all jumped in the back of the truck and headed on down to the farm to get to work. And as he used the word a penny a day, it comes from the term denarius. It indicates the idea of a full day's work. In other words, he was offering them a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. He wasn't making them an unfair offer. So he made them this offer, and understandably they were excited. They got ready and they got to work. Now I know we don't see this much at Home Depot here, but I've been told in bigger towns, and especially in border towns, you'll drive up to a place like Home Depot or Lowe's, and you'll see a group of men just standing there. They're just standing there hoping somebody needs work done, and they're going to hire them to take them back to the house. And that was the case here. There was just a group of men waiting, looking for work. And when he showed up and said, I'll pay you a fair day's wage, they were happy to hop in and get to work. And the lesson first off here is that once we've been once we're a saved person, the job is to get to work. And that was the point. He went to these people and he's talking about them as if they're saved, and he said that their job was to get to work. They immediately headed into the vineyard and they began to fulfill their purpose. And as we know we're designed to serve, then ultimately when we're a Christian, we're not serving, we're not meeting the design and purpose of our life. So again, he picks these people up. He said, I agree to pay you a fair day's wage. Hop in the truck and let's go. And they all agreed to it. And because the vineyard was so massive, the landowner went back to the marketplace to find more manpower in verse 3. And what's interesting is he told the first guys what he was going to pay them, but he didn't tell the rest of them what he was going to pay them. In fact, he said in verse 3, and he went out about the third hour, 9 o'clock, and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said unto them, Go you also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Now, it seems kind of strange to us that you would start a day's work not knowing what you're going to get paid. Can you imagine someone hiring you and you say, well, what's the pay? I'll pay you fairly. Okay, well, what's fair? You'll see. How about you tell me what fair pay is? But they didn't even argue. They just hopped in the truck and got to work because obviously they needed to get paid and they were willing to do the work. But he said, I'll give you a fair wage, a fair day's pay for your work. And there was no discussion. They simply agreed to get to work because they worked on a promise that whatever was right, they would get paid. And the truth is, as a Christian, when we get into God's service, we operate on the same promise. Yes, we've read and pastors taught on the crowns that can be had and other things, but the truth is, I still don't think we know by any means even a tiny portion of all the things that await us. Why? Because we even know, as John the Revelator were talking, he said, you don't even know what's awaiting you. You can't even fathom what God has laid up for you. So when we chose to enter the service of God, we entered in with the same promise that these guys did. We entered in with the promise, the fact that, look, if you'll get to work in my vineyard, I will take care of you. And that's exactly what these workers started with, was nothing more than a promise. Then 3 hours later, he goes back and gets some more. Now it's getting towards noon, so halfway through the day at this point. He did, and then he did it again. He did it again in 3 more hours at 3, and then he did it once more at 5 o'clock. And as he went and brought these workers in, he kept hiring and bringing more workers in. The very last workers, you realize when he picked them up, he said it was the 11th hour. So when he picked up these very last workers, they got on. You can imagine they'd sat in this marketplace hoping to get hired all day long. Now it's 5 o'clock. It's about time to go home, but yet they didn't go home because they had a family to feed. They had people to take care of, and they were willing to go to work even if it was for such a short period of time. And when he picked them up, he said, look, I'll pay you what's fair. And of course, they're thinking the day's almost over, so whatever you want to pay me is what you'll pay me, but I need money. And the custom of those days was that a servant was to be paid at the end of their day's work. A day's work, a day's wage. Now, nowadays it doesn't work like that. You get paid, if you start work on Monday, you're not going to get paid for 2 weeks. And then you might get paid every 2 weeks, you might get paid once a month, might get paid weekly, whatever the case may be. But their custom of the day was you worked, and at the end of the day, the boss paid you. And so at the end of the day, all these workers get together, and he brings them all together. He said in verse 8, when even was come, the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his steward, call the laborers and give them their hire. So the men get up in a line, and they're all lined up, and he said, look, specifically, I want you to start with the ones that got here last, and then work to the ones that got here first. Now, what's interesting about that is he was trying to draw attention to what he was going to pay the ones that got there last. Now, I know in today's day and age, we tell people, don't let the other workers know what you're making. I mean, I tell people when I hire them that, say, look, we're going to get along great. We're going to be in a small work environment, just me and the two of you, but don't talk to each other about pay because it's different. Someone that's been here 2 years gets paid different than someone that's been here 2 days. They don't get equal pay, so we need to understand, don't talk about it. But instead, he shows the steward flipping it over, and he takes the person that's been here 60 minutes and starts paying them before the one that's been here 12 hours. And he does it on purpose. And as he gets ready to pay them, he starts again with the ones that had gotten here last. And these are the people that had been barely working for even an hour in the field, and they were operating on only a promise. They were told that if they'd get to work, that he would take care of them. And the master of the field was generous. In fact, he gave them a full day's wage. You can imagine how excited they would have been. They thought, man, I only worked an hour, and he paid me for a full day. In other words, my family gets to eat tomorrow. And the ones who had worked so long, you can imagine them sitting there looking at each other, ribbing each other, going, did you see what he just did? And he gave those guys who've been here an hour a whole penny. Man, imagine what he's going to do for us. When he gets to us, this dude might give us like 5 pennies. This is going to be great. And then as he goes through the line, the man just keeps going out, going, penny, 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 penny. And you can imagine the look and the disgust when they've realized what had happened. You know, there's been people that have tried the equal pay idea, and I understand it's the socialistic idea that's being pushed so hard. Look, equal pay does not make people happy. I think this, if anything, even Jesus understood that, because that was the point. But equal pay doesn't make people happy. They get to the end and they get paid the same thing and go, wait a second, I worked 12 hours and they worked 1. I worked through the heat of the day and they showed up when the sun was going down. This isn't fair. And I think there's another lesson to be taught here in the fact that God decides what's fair, we don't. You ever hear kids, well, that's not fair. I say kids nowadays, more like, 20, 30, 40-year-old, as they call them, snowflakes. Well, that's not fair. Well, life wasn't meant to be fair. I'm sorry. But as he hands out these pennies, it caused the people that had been there from the very beginning to get upset. In fact, in verse 11, but when they received it, they murmured against the goodman of the house. And they offered a great rationale for the reason why they deserved more. Because they said that we'd worked through the heat of the day, that he'd been there all for 12 hours. But in verses 13 through 16, we find him picking up, and he says to him simply, but he answered one of them and said, friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way, and I will give unto the last, even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the last shall be first, and the first last. For many be called, but few chosen. Good morning. Good to see y'all. So we are in Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20. But as he gets as he's dealing with this section, and they're getting all upset about the fact that they didn't get paid extra, even though they'd done this, even though they had gotten paid exactly what they were promised. He reminds them that there was no injustice done. He said that essentially all servants are his, and he chooses to endow them however he so chooses. Anyone in here mad that you weren't given, the most beautiful singing voice ever? There's times where I wish I had a beautiful singing voice. There's something to be said for that preacher that just gets up and can just pull out a guitar and sit there and sing and strum a guitar and just have an audience just based on that ability. That's not me, obviously. I've tried playing the guitar before, and it's just not my thing. And I sing, but I sing with the best voice I can. But I'm not that person. And the truth is, as he gives to these servants, he said, look, not all servants are endowed the same way. There's people that you're going to sit there in heaven and you're going to look at them and see the reward they received. You go, but Lord, didn't I serve you for 40 years long? That person got saved and they only served you for a year before they passed, or 6 months before they passed. Why do they deserve a reward when I labored for so long? And I think that's exactly what he was trying to get across to these men, because as we'll know, they pick up immediately into the, well, who's going to be first argument. We'll see us 12, we left everything to follow thee. What's in it for us? What do we get out of it? And so as he deals with these, he's trying to teach these servants something. First of all, the fact that God determines what's fair. Our focus must be to fulfill the purpose that God has given us and leave the produce up to him. We ultimately have to say that God, ultimately, I'm just going to do what you've told me to do. And I'm going to leave the results up to you. I'm going to leave the benefit up to you. So as he deals with this parable of the sowers of the vineyard workers in verses 1 through 16, he tells us again that ultimately our job is to be a worker. Number two, we're to work for God regardless of what the results are. And number three, we're not to worry about what God does for other people. Secondly, we're going to see in Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 through 29, the patience that Jesus has towards his servants. As soon as he finishes up this parable, it's as if normally when Jesus teaches a parable, he teaches it to follow up a mistake. In other words, they say something silly and he comes back with a teaching to fix that problem. Jesus did it backwards this time. He knew what was coming. He knew that they were about to, the mom of two of his disciples was about to walk up and ask for their right to be at the right and left hand of Jesus in his kingdom. And before it even happened, he went ahead and answered their issue before the issue even came up. But here in this section, we'll see after this parable that, we know that Jesus would be heading up to Jerusalem. It'd be his very last trip to Jerusalem, in fact, because this trip would be the trip that he would be put on the cross. And as he was on his way there to the Passover, he was going to be, of course, the sacrificial lamb. You can imagine there was droves of people coming because this was Passover. So they would bring animals and things to sacrifice to God. You can imagine as they were walking down the road, somebody's got a rope pulling a little lamb beside him. You can almost imagine Jesus looking over and saying, you're not going to need to do that when I'm done. When I'm done, these animals won't have to follow you to Jerusalem anymore because I will be the lamb sacrificed. So you can imagine Jesus seeing this, and his mind should be so wholly focused on the cross at this point that it's almost as if he would have blinders on to everything around him. But that's not what you see with Jesus at all. In fact, on his way to this Passover, you're going to find he does another miracle. In verse 17, we'll start there. He said, "And Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples apart in the way and said to them, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify him. About the third day he shall rise again. Then came to him the mother of Zebedee's children with her sons, worshiping him and desiring a certain thing of him. And he said unto her, What wilt thou? She saith unto him, Grant that these my two sons may sit, the one on the right hand and the one on the left, in thy kingdom. And then he picks up, and we're going to move further into that. It says, Can you drink of my cup? And they said, Oh, yeah, we can. And of course, they will drink of his cup. Of course, his cup of being put to death. And then it moves on here in verse, let's see here. In verse 30, and behold, two blind men sitting on the wayside, when they heard that Jesus passed by, cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And the multitude rebuked them, and they cried more. And then in verse 31 and verse 32, he heals them. So he leaves from dealing with this parable about the service of the servants in the vineyard, and then he's going to deal head on with the issue of the mom bringing this question, and then dealing with the idea of this of this healing. But we know he goes straight from talking again about the cross to the disciples worrying about who's going to be first again. As he gets into this section, we're going to see that this. Excuse me, lost my spot there for a minute. As we describe this section, he's going to pick up talking first of all about the passion that he's going to face on the cross. As a young boy when he was in Jerusalem, Mary and Joseph had lost sight of him. They, in fact, were traveling back, and they went, Whoa, wait a second, where's Jesus? They had to turn around and go back to Jerusalem to find him. And when they found him, what did he tell them? He said, Come on, I'm about my Father's business. And of course, at that moment, they rebuked him, and he went back home at that point to pick up his ministry later when he was 30 years old. But at that moment, he said, I'm about my Father's business. So you can imagine as Jesus is traveling back to Jerusalem, in his mind, he's saying, I'm coming back to finish what I started when I was a boy. And of course, he knew the timeline that was meant to work out, but he thought, I started my ministry here, and I'm going to finish it here. And as he's getting ready to walk into this place and traveling there, he didn't hesitate for a moment, knowing what would greet him when he went there. He knew that as those lambs were led to the slaughter, you remember the verse that says, Jesus as a lamb led to the slaughter, or as he went as dumb, as a sheep dumb before his shears. In other words, he didn't speak up, he didn't fight his case. He was led in like a sheep to the slaughter. And that's exactly as those men and women were leading these sheep in by maybe a rope or something, leading them into Jerusalem. Jesus was leading himself in just the same way, knowing that he was going there to be the sacrificial lamb. And as he gets into this section here, we have to consider the patience that Jesus had towards his servants. We first of all realize that he predicts his passion. In other words, what he's going to go through when he gets here in Jerusalem. And pretty much from when he preached, when he taught them in Matthew chapter 16 and 4, he spoke pretty consistently about the cross that was going to come. But here in this section, he reveals more details than he'd revealed up until this point. He reveals in verse 18 that he would be delivered over to the Hebrews, or to the Jews. He said, behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death. So he reveals, when I get there, the Jews are going to be the first ones that are going to turn me over. Second of all, he's going to be turned over to the heathen hands. He said, verse 19, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify him. So he said, first of all, it's going to start with me being delivered into the Jews' hands. Then I'm going to be delivered into the Gentiles' hands. And then thirdly, he's going to say that I'm going to rise again, the second part of verse 19. And the third day, he shall rise again. So Jesus would sit there and perfectly lay out exactly what's going to happen when he gets to Jerusalem. That's why when people say, oh, Jesus, the cross was plan B. The cross wasn't planned, but he used it. No, it was planned for the moment. As he's walking there, he said, guys, it's going to start off with the Jews getting upset with me and taking me. Then they're going to hand me over to the Gentiles, and then I'm going to die, but I'll come back again on the third day. He laid out the exact plan in full place. And Jesus would suffer every kind of experience you can imagine. He would discover the heartache of a friend's betrayal, because one of the 12 that had worked with him for so long would be the betrayer. He would discover the heartbreak of the disciples' desertion. Nobody here likes it when a friend walks away from us. He said, the 12 best friends I could have in life, one of them would be the one to turn me over, and the other 11 would all deny me and would run away. He would discover the heaviness of rejection, because they had the option to free either Barabbas or Jesus, and they chose Barabbas instead. He would receive the humiliation of mocking, as they would give a trial that was never meant to be a trial whatsoever. Instead, it was to be a witch hunt. They were trying to kill him regardless. And then he would go through the helplessness of scourging, the horror of crucifixion, and then ultimately the burden of bearing our sin. And so this far, this has probably been one of the most comprehensive statements on what was to come that Jesus would make. And after he goes through all of this and he predicts exactly what was going to take place, he was using this as a teaching session for his disciples. And it would end up becoming a teaching session for what it means to be patient. While he was teaching them about the cross, they were worried about crowds. While he was teaching them about the passion he was going to face, they instead were thinking about the promise of gifts they were going to receive. And the truth is, we find ourselves some of the times in the very same spiritual stupor that they were, always thinking of ourselves and focusing on ourselves. And this incident reveals the magnitude that mercy has, because at this point, can you imagine Jesus? He's sitting there laying out the plans, saying that he's going to die. It's kind of like a person. You're getting ready to die. You have cancer. You know that the time is near. You've been given a stage 4 diagnosis. There's no treatment possible. You're getting ready to die. And you're telling your kids about the things that you want them to remember you by. And I want you to do this. And I want you to serve God with all your heart. And then one of your kids raises their hand like, yes, Tommy, what is it? Do I get to have the car when you go? And you're like, come here. I don't have much strength yet, but if I can break your nose, I'm breaking it. I'm sitting here laying out and pouring out my soul to you, and you just want to know, do I get the car when you go? You want to know, do I get the house when you kick the bucket? Can we talk about that later? And yet Jesus, as he's laying out exactly the punishment and the things he's going to go through on the cross, what do you find? You find two of the disciples getting their mom to come in on their behalf and ask to be put in first and second in charge of the kingdom. And of course, this time they're still thinking there's going to be a kingdom set up on here on earth at that exact moment. There will be later, but they're thinking at that exact moment. And Jesus is like, did you listen to nothing I just said? Nothing. I just told you we're going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to die here, and I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to be risen again, and you're still asking me who gets to be on the right and the left-hand side. But it reveals the absolute mercy that God had. As Jesus put his desires for the disciples under great scrutiny, his microscope exposed their purely selfish motive. In verse 21, we see the mom of two of them comes and says, grant that these my two sons may sit, the one on the right hand and the other on the left in my kingdom. Jesus revealed their ignorance when he said, you know what? You don't really know what you're asking. He said, but Jesus, in verse 22, but Jesus answered and said, you know not what you ask. Are you able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And of course, just like impetuous people we are, they said, oh yeah, we're able. And of course, they had no idea. They sat there and said, oh, we can do it. Yeah, that's no problem. What they didn't know was what he was talking about wasn't saying, look, you're not going to drink of the regal golden scepter cup full of beautiful wine. He said, no, I'm talking about the cup of wrath from God. He said, are you able to be baptized with my baptism? He wasn't talking about being dunked in the river. He was talking about being baptized, in other words, being put under the poured over with the punishment of God for sin. And ultimately, they spoke up like impetuous people, and they said, oh yeah, we're able. Now, Jesus' answer was not what they were hoping for. You read in verse 23, he said, and he said unto them, saith unto them, ye shall drink indeed of my cup, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared of my Father. They just got the worst end of that deal, didn't they? So yeah, we can handle it. We can drink of the cup. He said, okay, that's fine, because you will drink of the cup, and you will be baptized with my baptism, but I can't promise you the right and left, because I don't give that. The Father is the one who gives that position. And we know that ultimately James would be the first disciple martyred, and John would be the last. And he would be banished to the salt mines at Patmos after they tried multiple attempts to kill him and were unsuccessful. But ultimately, the disciples would all die as a result of their service to God. So he said, ultimately, yeah, you will drink of this cup. And Jesus was saying that it's not up to me at this point to assign the positions in the kingdom, because that's up to the Father. And of course, the other disciples immediately got mad. In verse 29, it said that, and when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against the two brethren. Now, you can imagine this moment. They all got mad when they realized that they had sent their mom to go try to get them a space in the kingdom of God. And I don't think they were mad that they did it. I think they were mad they didn't think of it first. I think they were like, oh, man, that was a great idea. I can't believe I didn't think of that first. Man, I should have thought of that. But, even as they coached their mom to get involved in this, the truth was the fact that they were, again, thinking about themselves. So the lesson that Jesus was trying to teach is the fact that they have to learn the proper definition of greatness. They thought that being great was being given a position of authority, but instead Jesus would teach them that greatness isn't like that. He would say in verse 25, but Jesus called them unto him and said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them, but it shall not be so among you. But whosoever shall be great among you, let him be your minister. The term great, or the idea when he said that he said those that are princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion. The idea there literally means to lord over. It's the idea of a harsh and a severe rule and power. This type of greatness is the type that dominates everyone under them to make them feel as if they're inferior to them. So he said, look, this is the kind of dominion that you're really hunting. He said, I know your heart. You're not trying to be standing at my right side so you can be better servants. You're standing at my right side so you can have authority over others. And he said, in my kingdom, that's not how it works. He said, in fact, but it shall not be so among you. You know, the disciples wanted to be great, but he said, you've missed the point. You want to be great? He said, get to serving. Some of the people that have the biggest funerals and are remembered the most by people on this earth, they weren't remembered because they were a boss. They were remembered because of how they treated people. You know, you can have a person that's a millionaire, that's got tons of money, they've got lots of influence, but when they die, nobody's there to see their death. Why? Because they were a terrible lord over their dominion. But then you have a guy that was a worker, he could have been even a migrant worker, just literally just working with the hands of his own two hands, and yet at his funeral there was a bunch of people standing there. Why? Because of their service, because of their servant's attitude. Can you remember who in the Bible it was that the people begged the man of God to raise back from the dead? They didn't ask for the man of God to raise back other preachers. Didn't ask him to raise back other men of God that had lived from past. They asked for one person, Tabitha, or goodness, why am I saying Phoebe and Tabitha? It's my daughter's names. Dorcas. They asked for Dorcas, Tabitha, essentially, to come back. They begged of him, saying, you've got to bring this woman back. And they sat there and showed the coats that she had made, told stories about the times that she had taken them into their house when they didn't have a place to live, when she had fed them with food when they didn't have food to eat, and they said, we need this woman back. So who was it that the people wanted back so bad they would beg the man of God to bring it back? It was a woman that was, I can't help but picture, it was somebody like Miss Natalie. Someone that the world would say, what importance are they? But I promise you, when Miss Natalie leaves her neighborhood, everyone in the neighborhood will know it. My sister lives in the neighborhood and loves Miss Natalie. Her neighbors care about her because she cares about them. So when she leaves a hole in her neighborhood. And he said, look, it's not about gaining dominion for power. He said it's about gaining influence by being a servant. And he said, so ultimately, guys, you're so worried about being who's in charge because you want the power to tell people what to do. In my kingdom, it's not about that. Those that are with authority are with authority because they're great servants. And he said, you've missed the whole point of being in charge. In fact, Jesus reveals that their entire purpose was focused on themselves. It was focused on their own greatness. But he said, ultimately, follow my example, because he said, verse 28, the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. So as he's telling us about this design, that we were designed to be servants from the beginning, he showed us a parable of our service. And he gave the example of the fact that, look, you guys are all in it for what you get paid at the end. You should be in it for the labor of the work. Then he showed us the patience he had towards his servants, that even when he was sitting there pouring out his heart, they were still worried about who's first. And yet he didn't destroy them. He didn't strike out against them. He could have just sat there and gone, Lord, time out. I need a redo. Can we just roll the clock back 3.5 years and I'll just pick 12 others? He didn't do that. And the truth is he's the master of time. Don't you think Jesus could have sat there and gone, well, hit the pause button. I picked the wrong 12. Let's rewind. 3.5 years. Okay, hit play, and I'm starting over, and I'm picking a whole different 12 because these guys are awful. But he didn't. He still showed mercy to them and patience with them. And lastly, in verses 29 through 34, he shows the pity towards the suffering. Jesus, as he's getting ready to become the sacrificial lamb, again, you would think he would have blinders on, but he didn't. He's walking through this crowd, and 2 blind men heard that Jesus was coming. And what do? They start screaming out, Jesus, Son of David. And the people are sitting there going, shh, be quiet. You're being annoying. And they said, I don't care. And they kept screaming out, Jesus, thou Son of David. Because they wanted him to come and heal them. And in this very moment, Jesus showed the ultimate servant's heart. He should have been so goal-focused on the cross that he wouldn't be listening and say, guys, it's too late. I'm headed to the cross. You missed me. You should have caught me earlier in my ministry. I'm coming to the end. The twilight is here. But he didn't. He didn't do that at all. In fact, in verse 29, it says, "And as they departed from Jericho, a great multitude followed, and behold, two blind men sitting by the wayside, when they heard that Jesus passed, cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And the multitude rebuked them, because they should hold their peace. But they cried the more, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And Jesus stood still and called them, and said, What will ye that I shall do unto you? And they said unto him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion on them, and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him." At this very moment, we notice that these first two men were crying out to Jesus. We know from Mark chapter 10 that one of their names was Bartimaeus, but we know that they were both blind, and they both wanted to receive their sight. You can imagine how terrible being blind their whole life would have been. They didn't have Braille handwriting. They didn't have seeing eye dogs. They didn't have, all these different things. So being blind meant you literally could do nothing. And Matthew records these two men heard this commotion coming. They heard that Jesus was passing by, and they knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they were not going to let it pass them by. They said, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. They didn't care what others were saying. They didn't care that others were saying, Be quiet. Keep it to yourself. They said, I don't care. This is the opportunity of my life. I'm not going to let it pass me by. That's the same attitude someone has when they say, Look, I know that nobody cares about serving God, and everyone thinks that this whole Christian thing is a scam, but I want to be healed. Hear me, O thou Son of David. Have mercy on me. Each and every one of us had to do that when we got saved. We had to cry out against the crowd and say, Have mercy on us. And we noticed the criticism of the multitude. But this crowd, as they attempted to shut these men down, they cried yet the more. And we observed the compassion of Jesus. As Jesus was walking about, he heard them, and he stood still. You can imagine this great procession of people following Jesus, and he just stops. And he turns and looks over him, and he said, Come over here. Imagine the group walking over, and they don't know where they're going. They're just being led to him. And he simply says, What would you have me do? This hush comes over the crowd, and as he calls them over, he simply says, What would you want me to do? And they said, Of course, we wish to be made whole, to see. And it said that he had compassion on them. This was a pattern for Jesus, wasn't it? He saw people in need, and he had compassion on the multitude. And even as he got ready to go to the cross, what was he doing? He was displaying his compassion. He's saying, What would you have me to do? And they said, We want to be made whole. He said, I'll do that. Even up to the point of the cross, he was still thinking about others, because he was a servant at heart. And he said, ultimately, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to be a servant of others. So if Jesus said, when I came here and I'm the very Son of God, I came to be a servant, then why should we expect to be any less? Why should it always be about us? Why should we go to a church and think, I go here because, what are you going to do for me? What programs do you have for me? What processes do you have in place to benefit me? It shouldn't be that. Instead, it should be, I'm here to work in this vineyard. What do you need me to do? Do you need me carrying boxes of the grapes? Do you need me on my hands and knees picking out the weeds? Do you need me standing there on a ladder pulling out the grapes? What do you need me doing to get me to work? And ultimately, that's why as a member of Lighthouse Baptist Church, it shouldn't be about, what program do we have for me? What are these chairs comfortable enough? Is there enough space to make me feel comfortable where I am? Is there a program in place that makes me feel good about myself? Are the sermons that lift up my spirit and make me feel good about myself? No. It should be, hey, I joined, this is my vineyard, I'm a servant, put me to work. What do you need me to do? And that's the whole point of this chapter, is the fact that it's not about what do I get out of it. And that's what he was trying to give through that parable. Instead, it's simply about being a worker, being willing to work because you've been called into the field. Well, it is time for us to finish, so let's go ahead and let's pray. Lord, I do thank you for this time in your word. Lord, I know that as Jesus was trying to tell these disciples about his passion he would face, they again were always concerned about what do I get out